Hello, David Pylon, St. Valentinus Gnostic Church, here again to do another video in the continuing lecture series. This time I wanted to discuss a little bit more in specific detail about the beliefs and teachings of the Valentinian and Marcosian churches as they were in antiquity. So I've touched on this a little bit before on basically every video. But I wanted to go into a little bit more detail than I might have previously, or that I can remember, that I can recall. So we don't know enough. We don't know a whole lot. There's going to be a lot of ground cover, so I apologize if I forget anything. I should have like some footnotes so I remember like cover this topic and this one and that one. I'm just doing it mostly extemporaneously, kind of off the top of my head. But we do know some things because of documents that we have. There's the Nog Media Library, of course, but there are also additional documents we had before we discovered that, such as records of Greek and historian histories, as well as some of the mainline Christian or Catholic Church records. And so we get most of what we have through second or even third-hand sources that it's well, here's what this person said type of thing. So we always have to kind of question and wonder the extent to which it is accurate information, complete and accurate information. And that's why I always kind of say that, well, this is what we think they probably thought, or this is what we think they said, this is what someone else claimed that they said or taught. So I'm going to go through some of those different things. So within the Valentinian Church, I talked about before in the historical context that they have a separation that happens, we believe, sometime in the 200s AD, because when this starts getting discussed, it's sometime around the year 250 AD, I believe, that they bring this up, that it's already a thing that's happened, and it's clearly established that they have these two separate churches that have very different beliefs and practices, whereas they were one belief system previously. And the Western Church has this very clearly defined like moral and philosophical structure, which they did not used to have when it was actually Valentinus in charge. As I talked about before, he wasn't really trying to create his own church as much as he was trying to establish a school within Christianity, within Gnostic Christianity specifically, which he saw as just a separate sect or denomination of the Christian faith. He didn't see them and the Catholics or the mainline Christians as really in conflict with each other, the way his enemies saw him. But it evolves into something else where it does develop like a specific set of rules and beliefs and so on. And we don't have as much on that as I would like, but we do have enough that it kind of gives us some ideas of what some of their beliefs and practices might have been. And one of the documents that I brought up before is that they petitioned the Catholic Church to basically join them because they don't want to associate with the other church, the Eastern Church, anymore. And they also don't want to be persecuted and killed, obviously. They're like, okay, well, we'll become one of you. Let us join so we can just be like normal, quote-unquote, normal Christians and live in peace. And so we know some of what they allegedly believed or practiced because of that, because the church writes back to them and is like, well, get rid of all this. Get rid of all of your beliefs and practices, and then you can join us. But they had a set of moral and philosophical laws that they laid out, that a historian wrote down about them. They were called the Four Pillars. They were the four pillars of the latter Western Valentinian Church of the faith, four pillars of the faith. And so I was going to go into detail on that first because I find it interesting. So the first one is morality, by which I assume they meant a concept of universal basic morality. And this is something they claim to have been taught about by Valentinus himself. And we don't know the exact moral laws that they were claiming to follow, but we can take we take some guesses there. There's similar concepts that still exist today among some Jewish people. They talk about the Noahide laws. This concept, there are basic laws that are laid out between Adam and Eve and the generations of Noah that lays out how everyone should act regardless of if you're Jewish or not. And they say there's like 7 Noahide laws. And then there's the Unitarian Universalist Church, which has the 7 Unitarian Universalist principles, which they gathered from studying not just Christianity but other faiths and religions and seeing where they had common laws or principles or moral beliefs. And so they developed these 7 principles. And there's some overlap there. That's something I might get into later in a different discussion. There's something like 4 or 5 of the Noahide laws and the Unitarian Universalist principles that are like almost exactly the same as each other. And so this is a common idea that there's basically like a few strict beliefs or mores or principles that just seem to universally exist within different religions and faith traditions. And so they were like, this is the first rule, is you follow these. And then the second pillar is translated as either inclusivity or open-mindedness. It has kind of like a 2-pronged structure. That it's, firstly, that the church would include everyone, regardless of like race, nationality, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, prior religion, none of those things that they would discriminate against. They'd be like, all are welcome here. And the second part of it was that they would consider all text as sacred, and all religion, all faith is basically including like some level of divine inspiration. And clearly they're founded within Gnostic Christianity, and they considered that the I guess the true direction, you could say, at least for them. But they didn't want to discriminate against other people's beliefs, and so they say that you should read and study everything in order to gain knowledge and understanding and see, okay, well, this is where this lines up or doesn't within my own faith. And the third pillar is, I always forget this one. I don't know why my mind suddenly blanks on it. So I know the fourth pillar is well-being. I'm going to get to that in a second. It'll come to me. So we got morality, we got inclusivity or open-mindedness. Third pillar, spirituality. That's it. And by spirituality they meant more a combination of spiritual and mystical practice. That it was your own personal relationship with the divine. That you should develop your own personal set of traditions and beliefs, keeping the holidays, doing certain rituals, so on and so forth, that help you with your relationship with God or the divine. That was the third pillar. The fourth pillar is well-being, and they break this down, and they claim this was also something that Valentinius himself taught during his lifetime. Was that there were like 4 types of well-being. There was your physical health and fitness. There was your mental health. There was your communal well-being, which was the group, the church, the community. And then there was environmental, which was caring for the environment, caring for all living things, plants and animals and so forth. And so that was the fourth pillar, was caring for the 4 types of well-being. And so they said that was basically the central theme of their church was, we keep these 4 sets of laws, and within that they could have some variety. They could disagree with each other as far as certain beliefs and practices, individually or within a family or however, within the church, however you may have that set up, where they differ, as long as you kept like these 4 pillars of the faith, as long as you were moral and being open-minded and inclusive and having a personal spiritual mystical practice and caring for your own well-being as well as the well-being of those around you. that was being a latter Western Valentinian Gnostic. That was their faith. Within that, there are certain practices and traditions that they held that were unique to them. I brought it up before. It seems they switched to doing Sabbath practice kind of at the same time as the Jewish faith, as well as they seem to have adopted a lot of Kabbalah and Judaism into their practice. You didn't have to be kosher, but you could be. But they would observe like a lot of the Jewish holidays, and we know this because of that letter. At least that's what the Catholics accuse them of. As they say, if you want to join us, you need to stop celebrating the Jewish holidays. You have to celebrate only the Christian ones. Stop having your Sabbath like at the same time as Jews do it. Switch it to the Sunday church service. All these other things that we go, okay, well, if they're saying they're doing these things, they probably did them. And they also bring up, remove your heretical books, the Gnostic texts, and any mystical or pagan practices, because they had this practice. I talked about it before a little bit in the last video about the church services. Some of the churches, assuming they could afford it and had like the means, would have like these 4 candles that are on the altar that they'd light that say these represent like the 4 classical elements: earth, air, fire, water. And they'd say, sometimes they do like a prayer blessing, and they'd say, there's the 5th element is spirit, and that's the candle that we welcome to be lit within ourselves. This is kind of very like mystical and paganish sounding in some of their rituals, and the church was like cut out that stuff also. And also any Eastern practices. We don't know exactly what Eastern practices and beliefs they're saying they held, but we can kind of make an assumption that they absorbed some things from like Taoism, Buddhism, and Hinduism from exposures to those cultures, and probably just like some basic stuff that goes along with their teachings that didn't conflict with it. Like they probably believed in some form of reincarnation, and they probably also practiced like Tai Chi and yoga and things like that, meditation, which they felt probably, is my assumption, went along with their teaching and well-being. That they're like, well, this is just caring for your physical and mental and spiritual health that we do these things. It's not going against God or Jesus or anything. But the church disagreed and were like, no, this is bad. You got to get rid of that stuff also. And so they didn't. They were like, okay, we'll just be heretics then, rather than give up our whole culture and lifestyle. But those are their main beliefs and practices at that time, and it evolved from what it had been previously, because they were not as much structured as that during the actual times in the hundreds AD, when these people, Valentinius and Marcus Magus and Ptolemaeus was the other person I just recently discussed as the other student of Valentinius who takes over the church around 165 AD roughly. Ptolemaeus, he does try to make the Valentinians much more within the mainline Christian faith, and he tries to connect them to the Gnostics, to the other Gnostic churches, back to the main church. This is why we call him like the great systemizer. Is he actually does attempt to make it like a religion, whereas his teacher Valentinus really wasn't going for that. And so a lot of these things that the latter church practices or believes in most likely came either directly or indirectly through Ptolemaeus and his students, that they end up forming this more structured belief system. Because it wasn't that. It was still evolving and changing. There was a lot of disagreement and conflict between the leaders. They didn't quite see eye to eye on certain things. But the Eastern system goes off in an entirely different direction, and we get like some really scandalous accusations against them, and we're not sure the extent to which they're accurate, because they end up sounding like this kind of like weird sci-fi cult, basically, where they're kind of like, the Gnostic Christians are the only true Christians, but you don't actually know if you're one of them or not. Only God knows, and your fate is predetermined. But they also said that like the Gnostics were star seeds, like they were spirits of aliens that came from like other planets, and went into human bodies, and there was no way of telling if you were one of those or not, but you could do things to make it more likely. And they would say, like, allegedly, they're like, oh, we got to do, like, these sex rituals, like, in the church. We're going to, like, impregnate these women, and that's going to, with our sex magic, and that's going to make them more likely to have the starseed babies, who will be the saints. So then those guys can argue for them when they get into heaven. It was like, this just sounds like an excuse to, like, get women to sleep with you. This sounds kind of creepy and gross. But those are the things they're accused of. We're not really sure the extent to which that's actually accurate. And so that's why we get the Western Church looking at the Eastern Church and these things that are brought up against them and saying, we don't really want to be associated with that, or have people think that that's who we are. And so we're changing our faith, or at least attempting to. But the Marcosians, they continue to exist as a school within the Western Church, because they were out east, as brought up in the historical context a couple times. We think they might have been in Turkmenistan, was where Marcus's church was based. And then, like, after he disappears, a different person takes over the church, who starts pushing it in a different way. And this might be part of why we get the Eastern Church evolving, that the Valentinians and Marcosians, they are kind of absorb each other and get these new leaders who are maybe, like, kind of unscrupulous. And so the followers within that church, like, leave, and they go and join the sister church over in France. They're like, okay, we're going to migrate and go up there. We're going to join this community there. And we don't have as much about some of their later teachings and practices. We have much more about the way it was when Marcus himself was in charge, because we have people, like, spying on him and trying to get evidence to like get him judged as a heretic and put to death, basically. But we do have records of, like, some of the older beliefs and practices and so on, but they weren't necessarily complete or accurate also. And like I said, they tended to disagree with each other and argue back and forth about certain things. And so I'll try to go, like, topic by topic that I can remember, and kind of explain what some of those subjects might have been. It's like the nature of God. Is God, one, or is he two? Are we dualist? Is he three? Do we believe in the Trinity? The answer is yes. All of the above. And I'll get into that more later in the creation myth. But the Valentinians and Marcosians, unlike a lot of the other Gnostics, were like, yes, we are dualists, but no, we're not. We are, but we aren't at the same time. And we also believe in the Trinity. Most of the other Gnostics rejected the idea of the Trinity. They weren't Trinitarians. The Valentinian and Marcosian schools of thought were more, we believe in the Father, the Mother, and the Son, and the Heavenly Mother Sophia, according to Valentinus at least, was the same thing as the Holy Spirit. And he's like, there's two different expressions of the same thing. So we believe in the Trinity. We just believe it in a different form and under different terms. But they also believed in dualism. But Valentinus explains that it's not really. Because to him, he goes, okay, so God has these two sides, the masculine and the feminine, but they're in eternal, symbolic, spiritual lovemaking in heaven. So they're joined, so they're one. So they're two, but they're one. And Ptolemaeus seems to echo, if I can speak, Ptolemaeus seems to echo a lot of his master Valentinus' teachings, whereas Marcus Magus, while he claims to be Valentinian Gnostic and imposes the idea of, say, Marcosianism as a separate church, that he wasn't trying to establish that, he significantly differed, and so, as I've said before many times, I kind of agree with some of Irenaeus' assessments of these people and their beliefs, where he laid it out, okay, this is this group, this is that group, here's some of their, where they differ in their interpretations of things seems fairly accurate, at least in some cases. So, Marcus, we don't have as clear of an idea with him as to where he stood on those issues. We know he prayed in the name of the Father, Mother, and Son, whereas Valentinians prefer the more traditional Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and more in line with the Catholic Church or the mainline Church. Ptolemaeus, we don't necessarily see him saying that he prefers one way or the other, because he goes with kind of the same thing, so it doesn't really matter to him. But Marcus, much more than Valentinus or Ptolemaeus, seems to emphasize this idea of sacred sexuality and the divine feminine and divine masculine, and the two of them being in balance and harmony with one another, was much more a core concept of his church. And this is why we think, I'm skipping ahead a little, this is why we think he might have said that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married, because Mary Magdalene was revered within his church, and he taught from the Gospel of Mary Magdalene a lot. It was one of his central texts, and we don't see that this was necessarily as important to the Valentinians as it was to the Marcosians. But he was like, yeah, this is, we revere Mary Magdalene. She's possibly the lover, if not the wife, of Jesus. And she represents the embodiment of, like, the divine feminine. This is them being in balance and harmony with each other. And he doesn't even necessarily have to have been believed in that literally, because to him a lot of things were just symbols. They were just like spiritual metaphors. And he would explain this frequently in his teachings and be like, yeah, all this it represents something else. I don't necessarily believe that this is literally what happened, this is the way it is. It's just representative of a concept. But, so nature of God. Well, I'll get back on track here. So the demiurge. Demiurge is a concept within Gnosticism that there's a false god who's typically the creator. He creates the material world, and ergo the material world is an illusion or evil. Do the Valentinians and Marcosians believe in the demiurge? Yes. But they had differing and disagreeing beliefs that did not closely align with the other churches. So Valentinus, his opinion on the demiurge was just kind of, like I brought this up before, they just kind of said, like, yeah, he exists. And that's like about as far as he went into it. He's like, oh, that's just a thing. Ptolemaeus gets a little bit more detailed than that in, like, explaining how he sees the demiurge fitting in. As he goes into, like I said, I'll probably get into this in the next video, the Gnostic creation myths. And he tries to connect other Gnostic churches and sects and their beliefs with the mainline Christian church and connect that back into Valentinianism. That he's like, okay, well, this is the story of creation. This is how it worked out. And he comes up with a very detailed explanation. And then Marcus has like an entirely different idea. He's like, okay, yeah, demiurge bad. But he doesn't actually directly refer to him as the demiurge. He calls him the Great Archon. The Archons are kind of like these evil gods, primordial chaos gods, at least in the eyes of Marcus Magus. But he says he's sold away in another dimension. So he's like, yeah, he's not here anymore. He like exists symbolically below the earth, but not literally. He's not literally in hell or the underworld. He's actually in another plane of existence. But Valentinus and definitely Marcus don't see the material world as necessarily evil. I would say Ptolemaeus agrees. This is one of the few areas where they probably all agreed with each other. Was that the majority of the other Gnostics were like, yeah, the world is evil. Like the flesh is sinful. This is like we're trapped here. Our souls are trapped here. We need to escape this place so we can ascend and go to the other level of existence, where it's a better place than this one. Like basically, the world is hell, and you're trapped here. and you need to get out of it by stop being in your flesh. And the Valentinians and Marcosians disagreed. They were like, oh well, just be thankful. Ptolemy seems a lot more conservative and like structured and rigid. He's like, well, you need to do. He kind of agrees with Pauline doctrine a lot more. So Pauline doctrine is that what's based on the epistles of Paul. And Ptolemy frequently references and quotes them, so we think he accepts Paul as an apostle and accepts like those teachings as doctrine as church belief. And Marcus Magus, for all appearances, does not. He appears to have rejected Paul and just doesn't believe in the concept of quote-unquote Pauline doctrine. He does very interestingly teach from the Gospel of John, which was also frequently rejected by a lot of the other Gnostics. But Marcus Magus liked the Gospel of John, and he taught from it, but he also included Gnostic Gospels as well. But anyway, back on track. So Ptolemaeus kind of says, do things in moderation. All things are permissible to me, but not all things are good for me. So on and so forth. So he has this basic idea of like, well, are you doing things in moderation? Are you doing them in a way that's healthy for you, good for you? Are you doing them with love and thanks? Are you doing them in a spiritual nature, like practicing sacred sexuality? Then it's probably good. Then it's probably like that's what God wants for you, and ergo it can't be sinful. And Marcus seems like a lot more liberal than that. That he's like, yeah, I just don't think. At least this is the way Irenaeus portrays him, so we don't know how accurate that is. Is that Irenaeus mixing it out? That Marcus just kind of goes like, yeah, I don't think God really cares. Like do what you want as long as you're not hurting anybody. Like do as thou wilt, but harm none. He takes like more of that kind of like quote unquote left hand approach, based on Irenaeus' beliefs about him. Whereas Valentinus and Ptolemaeus are much more traditional and conservative, more closely based in a Judeo-Christian belief than that. Marcus Magus appears to take in like this much more liberal, quote-unquote, position of just saying like, yeah, if you're not hurting anyone, I don't think God really cares. So, at least, like I said, that's how Irenaeus portrayed him, so that might not be accurate, because it might have just been him trying to say, he's a bad dude because he goes against our beliefs. He says like just do what you want. If it feels good, do it. But to him, like I got sidetracked a little bit into their morality teachings. It connects. It relates back to like the demiurge and God and all that. To Marcus, demiurge is evil. But the material world itself isn't evil. It's something for us to partake in and enjoy. But also, it is an illusion. And he defines it as this kind of two separate kingdoms theory. He's like, well, there's the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man. And the kingdom of man is ruled by the demiurge, but not. It's indirectly, since he's sealed away in another dimension. I'll get into that more in the creation myth that he says, basically, the great Archon, as he calls him, had children, and his children seeded the world, and their seeds become like the world leaders, symbolically, metaphorically. The bankers and the emperors and the generals and all these other people, they're all seeded with evil inside of them that controls them, was Marcus's view. And Valentinus disagreed, that he was like, well, I think it's just like they're demonically possessed mentally by he called them, I brought this up before, thought contagions. He's like, yeah, they got thought contagion. And it's like, the thought contagion has demonically possessed them in mass as a group. They have like almost what we call mass hysteria, but not quite. He's like, they're controlled by like bad thoughts that have come from evil, that have invaded their minds and taken control of them. And Marcus was like, no, it's actually like, there's this evil god who lives in another dimension who left seeds of evil here that like sprouted and took human form symbolically, and like are controlling the world now, and so we have to stop them. The Roman Empire is evil, and we must crush them. That was Marcus's take on it, and Valentinus disagreed. And is like, you need to be more loving and forgiving. You know, be a little bit more like Christ. They seem to have had an argument back and forth with each other about that. So that's God, demiurge. I talked a little bit about sacred sexuality. It's something they seem to all believe in and agree with. They're like, yeah, we all kind of believe in this idea of. They weren't for abstinence, as far as we can tell. Valentinus explicitly wasn't. He said he thought it would breed perversion. They brought up like the abstinence of priests, and he was like, I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think we should do that practice. I think Valentinus specifically thought priests should be married. I talked about before, I think in the last video, that he writes a letter to Marcus, telling Marcus you should get married because people kept accusing him of like sex crimes, basically. And he was like, you need to stop all these scandals going on. Go get a wife. People think you're like a pervert. Marcus was accused of just being like into free love, I guess. That he was like, yeah, I don't think it's necessary. I don't want to get married. I'll just sleep around. I don't think God cares. At least, again, like I said, that's what Irenaeus said of him, and like it caused a huge controversy. Valentinus was like, yeah, maybe you should just get a wife so people stop saying these things about you. It looks bad on us. But Valentinus definitely doesn't believe in celibacy. He believes in marriage. He probably believed in sex in marriage. And he preached it as like a good thing for your health. And this goes back to the teaching of well-being. There was this time once, allegedly, that someone asked him, how did he live to be, like, old and healthy? Because he was, like, 80 when he died, and like, up until the last several years of his life when he got some kind of sickness. He got, like, a cancer or a plague or something. He was having, like, sores, and he was, like, bedridden. Up until then, he'd been, like, up and around and active and just, like, mentally alert and physically moving around. And they're like, how did you do this? How'd you live so long and remain so healthy? In that day and age. And he was like, well, I walk everywhere, I read everything, I pray and meditate daily, and I garden, and I have, while she was alive, regular sex with his wife. He said those were his reasons as why he lived a long and healthy life. And they asked him, like, was there anything more than just those things? And he's like, well, I don't know if it's as important or if it helps as much as those things, but I keep a kosher diet. I recognize the Sabbath and take a day of rest every week. And I tithe monthly. It's like I do those three things from, like, observing Jewish culture, basically, as well. And he's like, I don't know if they helped as much as the other things, as the gardening and the sex and the walking and the reading and praying and so on. They definitely don't hurt. It's like, this is how you should live your life if you want to live a long and healthy life. He was also apparently very much into fitness, and it's funny because in one of the documents he allegedly wrote, he's talking about Jesus saying you should carry the cross, and he kind of says, like, how are you going to carry the cross if you're weak? You go to the gym, get swole, pick up your cross. Like ancient Joe Rogan going on all of a sudden. But he said you need to be strong so that you could be like a good man, so you go like defend women and children who are in danger. This is what Jesus wanted you to do. So he's like, go be Rambo. But that was also part of his belief system and his take on things. We don't know if Marcus or any of the others necessarily agreed, but they probably didn't disagree. They're probably like, yeah, why not? Marcus seems very political and kind of militant. He did not like the Romans, and he basically says at one point, kind of like Boondock Saints like, that he's like, let them come and I'll send them to whatever god they believe in. He was just ready with his sword. He was like, yeah, like he can come arrest me if they want. Let them try. So he's just like out here in the middle of nowhere, gathering his people and building farmlands. We don't have we don't have good socioeconomic, political allegories for what they were now, because our systems now probably wouldn't make sense to them in the same way that their systems then don't necessarily follow our traditional ideas. So to say if like they're capitalist or communist or anarchist or whatever doesn't really fit. We do know they had some level of communal living and sharing of wealth and so on. We know this within the Marcosians because a controversy happens once that a rich woman, I believe, I might be wrong, might be misremembering, she was like they called a Hellenistic Jew. They were Jewish people who converted to paganism, basically. She's like a rich wife. She has her money from her husband is some type of general or something like that. I don't remember the exact details, but he's away on business or war or whatever was happening, and she's just kind of like left alone in their mansion with her servants. And she goes to Marcus's church, and she converts, and she's like, "Oh, I want to get into heaven. What do I do?" And he's like, "Well, Jesus said go sell all your stuff to the rich guy, so I guess you should do that. You gotta go sell all your stuff and give the church all your money." So she does, and her husband comes back from wherever it was he was, and finds out and is very upset, and like tries to sue Marcus. He's like, "You tricked my wife, like now we're poor." And Marcus is like, No, we'll, like, you're church members now, we'll give you land, we'll give you like, you can graze animals and plant crops and things, you can have like room and board here if you want. You gave up your wealth for the church, so the church will take care of you. So we do know they had that as like a type of belief and practice of just like communalism, you might call it. Oh man, what am I forgetting here on topics to cover? We know they did baptism. They believed in baptism. We know they believed in communion or the Eucharist. I brought that up before in the rites and rituals. Burial. They seem to have preferred burial over cremation. Some of the other Gnostic churches preferred cremation because they said you need to break your ties with the material world so you could escape this existence. They thought burning the body got you there quicker. The Valentinians and Marcosians seem to have disagreed. They're like, no, we're just going to bury our dead. We don't need to burn them. We're not going to like have their souls stuck here just because of their body. What else? They might have mummified some of their dead. They might have adopted some Egyptian practices. And the reason they would do that was the exact opposite, like specifically so you could be tied here. And they're like, yeah, this person has a purpose to serve. They're going to protect some of our sacred texts. There is allegedly an incident where a person gets mummified and buried with some of the scriptures. And that we know of, we've never found them, so we don't know if that's true or not. We never found just like a mummy clutching like Gnostic text buried somewhere out there. Or someone might have, and we just don't know it. But that was something they allegedly did as well. The afterlife. They had no firm belief or agreement on that subject, that I can tell. So Valentinus' take, and I love Valentinus, but his kind of opinions on things are just generally, just shrugs his shoulders. Because he gets asked about the afterlife, and his basic response is, I don't know and I don't care. He's like, well, I'm alive here right now, so this is what I'm worried about. Why should I worry about that? Ptolemaeus disagrees. Marcus disagrees. Ptolemaeus seems the most idealist. He appears to imply to me that he's like, well, whatever you believe in, that's what you'll be judged by. But that's just one afterlife. I guess he just will go through multiple, almost like reincarnation, until you eventually get reconciled to God. Like he seems to appear to believe in what we might call eternal reconciliation of the soul. He's like, well, eventually you're going to go back to God. You're just going to go through other lives until you get there. And whatever you believe, that's what you'll be judged by. Marcus also appears to believe in some form of reincarnation, as I mentioned multiple times before. He's always talking about people returning, but he seems to have a problem with the resurrection of Christ, because he doesn't. He believes in basically everything up until that moment, and he has like questions and disbelief about it because he doesn't seem to believe in the idea of your physical body doesn't come back. He's like, if someone comes back from the dead, that's like a zombie. That's a ghoul. We go put them back down again. That's not. I mean, that's not a good thing. But he's always talking about people returning, like the saints and the prophets and Jesus. And so I have to assume when he's saying, "Oh, they're going to return," if he doesn't believe in physical bodily resurrection, then he, to me, has to be implying reincarnation, because no other explanation makes sense to me. So he's like, yeah, they're going to reincarnate. And he appears to believe that it's at least possibly some of the time you do so through your own bloodline. And so I think this might be possibly part of why as well, that he could have believed Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married, that they might have had a kid. He says if there is a bloodline of Christ through Mary, this is where we get into kind of like the Holy Blood, Holy Grail, Da Vinci Code type stuff. He says if that exists, then he presumes that Jesus will come back through one of his descendants, through one of his grandchildren or whatever. And he wants to go find that person so he can bring them back to the Roman Empire, because he thinks, this like up to me, this is my interpretation, and it appears only Marcus himself thinks this way. That's why I said he's kind of radical and militant and political. Is that he sees the return of Jesus as like this coming of like a conquering hero who's going to come conquer the evil empire, who believes are just like seeded with the evil of the Demiurge, and he's going to defeat them, and he's going to bring about the Messianic era, the 1,000 years of peace. So he has to go find the reincarnated Christ and bring him back so he can do this thing. Like he's like, we're going to go defeat the evil and bring about peace. That's how it's going to work. And he wanted to see that during his lifetime because he was worried about the afterlife. Because he was like, I don't know for sure what's going to happen or not. I asked my master, and he said he didn't know, he didn't care. So Marcus, in my opinion, appears to have been kind of worried. It's just like, maybe there's nothing. Like, maybe that's just it. And if that was the case, then he thought everything he was doing was just meaningless. It had no point. So he really wanted to see it happen within his lifetime so he could be sure. That's why it's important to him he was doing missionary work. This is another question. Missions. Oddly, Valentinus, he travels, he preaches the gospel, he sets up churches. He says he doesn't believe in missionary work. And it's kind of like, well, what are you doing? Like, what's the difference here? Marcus wanted like every single person who became a synod in his church, who completed the process of the rites and rituals. He was like, you're going to become a priest, regardless if you're a man or a woman. You're going to go set up another church in another country or continent. We're going to spread this all across the world. Because he wanted to fulfill the prophecy of spreading the gospel onto all the world so that Christ could return. Like, that was his ultimate goal. And Valentinus said, it'll happen in God's time. Like, literally just said, like, well, don't worry about it. If whatever's meant to happen will happen within God's time, it's in his control, I'm not worried about it. That's why Valentinus just kind of took it like, I don't know. I don't have the answers to this. Don't worry about it. that was his approach to everything. And Marcus was like, that's not good enough for me. I gotta know. I have to know. It needs to have meaning. That's why I say I'm a person after Marcus's heart. Priesthood. Let's touch on that since I just mentioned it. The Marcosians, at least, definitely. I don't know if the Valentinians necessarily, but the Marcosians definitely had both male and female priests. And Marcus was quite explicit that they were not to be called priestesses. He was like, we don't have a male priest and a female priestess. They don't do sex rituals in the church with each other. That's not the thing we're doing here. Men and women can go do like sex magic in private of their own bedrooms and homes, and he considered that holy and sacred. He was like, but that's a part of our religion that's not meant to be public. He didn't want people to think they were perverts, which they were always accusing him of being. They thought, like I said before, Irenaeus kind of thought it was like this weird BDSM cult that was going on. this Novium or Nexium, whatever that thing was called. And Marcus was like, it's not like that. That's not what we're doing here. So he was like, yeah, men and women are equal. That was a big thing to him. I don't know that since Valentinius came from this more kind of like traditional Jewish background, I don't know that he necessarily agreed as much. That they didn't. I think they probably didn't have female priests over there in the same way they did it with the Marcosians. But I could be wrong. They might have. Same-sex marriage, they probably didn't do. They did have some degree of inclusivity and what we call it, gay rights and so on. They weren't necessarily as discriminatory and prejudiced, as we might call it, as we might have seen the other churches, the mainline churches, being. But I doubt that they had same-sex marriage, because if they did, I think it would have shown up in the documents. I think Irenaeus would have been 100% against that, and it would have been like, this is one of their other evils and heresies. Because he was against the fact that they had women reading the Bible and being preachers and so on in church. So he was like, yeah, that's not good, that's not allowed. So there's this kind of weird thing within the Valentinians and Marcosians, since I talked about before, the normal church service. They would have randomly selected by chance that you were going to be the priest or the bishop or the deacon or whatever, or the prophet sometimes. And that would be just for that day and just for that service. That wasn't your official title, not for life. But they would have additionally that they would have people who were priests like Marcus, like Valentinius and so on, and they're like, yes, this is our role. This isn't necessarily going to be our role in the day-to-day church life. God decides that. But as far as running the church, we're the people who are in charge of it. And then our disciples that get selected for that role or that position, they'll be the next ones. But then they'll also just randomly choose people to perform the different rites and services during either the Sunday or Saturday, depending on church meeting. So those could be, anybody. It didn't matter your religion, your sexual orientation, your sex, if you were male or female. None of that mattered. They're like, we're not going to discriminate. It's one of our moral values that we want, that will include everyone. The church, the mainline church, the Catholics had a problem with that. But they also bring up against Marcus that they accuse him of having male priests and female priestesses, like some of the other churches had. They say this is more pagan sounding. It's like you got a embodiment of the god and goddess basically up here. We're doing sex rituals, and Marcus said, no, we don't do that here. That's not happening. What else? Marriage. They definitely believed in marriage and had marriages. Like I said, it appears to have been much more emphasized by Valentinius that he preferred you get married. And he believed a priest should be married. He was like, I don't believe a priest should be celibate, I believe a priest should be married. So he seems to have preferred sex in marriage. And Marcus, like I said, per the accusations of Irenaeus, thought that wasn't necessary. He was like, yeah, you can just have sex. You don't have to be married first. They might have had something similar to monks and nuns, and I talked about this before, within the Marcosian church, and I don't think it comes up within the Valentinians, but within the Marcosians, they had something called church marriage, and we don't know what this is. And there's disagreements amongst scholars, but some believe that basically means you're married to the church, means you're celibate, means you are a monk or a nun. And Marcus seems to practice this, and not himself personally, obviously, but he introduces the practice of it, and Valentinius kind of said he was against it. He didn't really believe in it. So I don't think the Valentinians necessarily did that. But the Marcosians, you could say, okay, I'm going to do this thing. But Marcus said it was optional. He was just like, yeah, everything's optional. You want to get married? Sure. You want to be celibate? Okay. I don't think God cares. That was Marcus's take on it. But you could assume that role or position as well. That you'd be like, okay, I'm marrying the church. I'm going to not be married or have sex and just like devote myself to the service of the church. That was an option. So they appeared to have had that based on my interpretation. Anything else? Am I forgetting anything? I think that covers like all the major beliefs of the church. I might be forgetting a few. I covered God, like the nature of God, the demiurge, the afterlife, burial, as opposed to cremation. There's a preference for that. Marriage rituals. We don't know. Or at least I don't know. I haven't read it or seen it anywhere. We do know some of the other Gnostic Christians practice hand fasting, which we see more commonly amongst, ironically, pagans now. The engaging in wedding rings was actually a Roman pagan tradition, and so they crossed each other. We see like exchanging wedding rings more normal as like a quote-unquote Christian tradition now, and hand fasting we see practiced amongst a lot of like the New Age and Wiccan and pagan types groups. But the Gnostic Christians were recorded as having done that, and it's in murals we found of them where they drew like, here's what our church service was like, and it's like, oh, here's a female priest doing a hand fasting. They're tying the hands together, and these two people are married. So it's like, oh, we know they had these things that they were doing. That the mainline church, the Catholic Church, was like, we don't like all that. Cut that out. So we know that was their marriage ritual, most likely. We don't know, but we do know, because we know the other sects who did believe in marriage, which not all of them did, because like I said before, some of them were against marriage and against sex, so they thought you should just like cut your ties to the world. The Valentinians and Marcosians disagreed with that. They were like, you should enjoy your life. So they practiced hand fasting as their marriage ritual, most likely. That's what we can assume. I think that's it. I think that's all the topics that I could remember that I wanted to cover. If I think of something else later, I'll probably add it in one of the other videos like I keep doing. But thank you for watching. Be blessed.